Our text for today is found in Joshua chapter 1. In verse 2, the Lord gives Joshua the kind of news that no one likes to get. Moses had taken God's people to where they could see the promised land from just across the Jordan River. Moses went no further. The Lord spoke to Joshua and told him that Moses, my servant, is dead. No heavier news could have come to God's people. Moses had kept them safe in times of danger. He'd been the only leader they'd ever known. He'd been the Lord's go-to guy on their behalf. For 40 years wandering in the desert, God's people had taken shelter behind the strength and wisdom and perseverance of Moses. Sadly, so far as we know, they never showed him any appreciation. Whatever went wrong, they blamed on Moses. But here's what he meant to them. You may remember Moses going up the mountain and being delayed coming down. You may remember that the people got restless while they waited. They approached Aaron and said to him, "We need some kind of God to go before us. How about you making one for us?" As for that fellow Moses, we don't know what's happened to him. Don't look like he's going to be coming back. By asking for a God, they're saying that to them Moses had been like some kind of God going before them. When Moses stayed away too long, it was like God being out of sight as well. In fact, to God's people, saying that Moses is dead was like saying that God was dead. I bet too that most of what they knew about God, they knew because of what they'd seen in Moses. Think about that. What if all that people knew about Jesus, they knew because of what they'd seen in you? What would they learn about Jesus because of what they'd seen in you? Think about that as well. Now, you could call the death of Moses a unique event, a one-time only kind of thing. After all, there'd only been one Moses. There'd only been one situation exactly like the one I'm talking about today. But in another sense, what happened isn't unique at all. Experience like it come to us as well. I remember Saturday afternoon, January 8th, 1966, like it was yesterday. My grandfather and I were in his den next to his wood stove watching the Wilburn Brothers show on TV. You might remember Doyle and Teddy Wilburn. Loretta Lynn got her start on their show. The phone rang that afternoon. The phone was in the hallway on a table next to an old-fashioned hall tree. That's where my grandmother would sit and do her talking and where she did her listening. And I say listening, but I really mean listening in. You see, my grandparents were on a party line. She liked to listen in. That day the phone rang. My grandmother answered it. I could tell by the hushed tones and the questions she was asking that someone was dead. She hung up and then came and told my grandfather that Verge Rye was dead. Now, Verge Rye was my great uncle. Him dying was a huge blow to my father and my father's family. He'd been like a father to my father, and he'd been the patriarch of my father's family. Uncle Verge was a fixer, one of those country kind of politicians who could sway voters and get out the vote. He'd see to the transportation and maybe give out some kind of liquid bonus for folks who voted right. He was the kind of fella who put people in and put people out, knew how to make things happen and get things done. He was the kind of fella you called if you needed the county to gravel your driveway for free. That all ended on Saturday, January 8th, 1966, because Verge Rye was dead. You know, for years we may live without any kind of worry. Over time, we start taking the blessings of God for granted. Then life takes a turn for the worse. Now, I'm not talking about COVID-19. It's a once-in-a-lifetime kind of thing. I've said all along that our response to it shouldn't be reckless, it shouldn't be brazen, it shouldn't be selfish. That if we err, we should err on the side of caution and taking care of our neighbor. Today, I'm talking about the kind of setbacks and disappointments that happen more than once in a lifetime. All of a sudden, we find ourselves facing some kind of setback or disappointment that we thought could never happen to us, would never happen to us, but then it does. And we feel like God's people must have felt when the Lord told Joshua, "Moses, my servant, is dead." Notice what else the Lord said. He said, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then." Now then, what? is a question we all have to answer when we suffer a setback. A lot rides on our answer to that question. What's our next step going to be? That's mighty important because Christians and non-Christians, young and old alike, are watching to see what we Christians are going to do. Now some quit. That's their next step. That's their answer to the question. When Moses died, I bet some of God's people looked around and said, Moses was a great man. We didn't know it then, but now we do. As great as he was, he couldn't get us to the promised land. Now he's dead. And who's this fella Joshua? How can he do what Moses couldn't do? Now they'd forgotten how Joshua had made progress over time. He'd gone from slave to soldier, to servant to spy, to successor to Moses. If any man was ready to follow Moses, Joshua was that man. Still, with Moses dead, some would have been looking to get out while the getting was good, forgetting that how we respond determines our progress later on. Now others blame. Their next step is to blame. They look for an eye to poke. Joshua might have blamed God for Moses dying. He might have complained that God had let him down. He might have turned on God and said, we're not there yet, Lord. We needed Moses to get us there, yet you took him just when we needed him most. This mess is all your fault. Now that kind of reaction is a common human response. When things go wrong or the world goes wrong, multitudes who couldn't care less about the church, and even some who do, look for someone or something to blame. A lot of time, it's the church. The church is convenient, but even more convenient is God. God gets the blame. Why did he let this happen, people ask. And folks decide that God must not be doing anything because he can't do anything, forgetting that how we respond determines how we progress later on. Now still others negotiate. Their next step is to bargain with God. They promise to do certain things if God will do certain things. You remember Jacob when he was on the run from his brother Esau. In Genesis chapter 28, Jacob had a dream. Some say that Jacob was a new man after he dreamed his dream. I don't believe it. Don't believe a word of it. When he woke up, it was a new day, but it was the same old conniving Jacob looking in the mirror that morning. Like we do sometimes. Jacob said, Lord, if you get me through it, I'll serve you the best I can for the rest of my life. And God does get us through. But then life goes back to how it was before. We've all done that, forgetting that how we respond determines our progress later on. In verse 2, the Lord called out to Joshua and said, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, get up, get moving, and get on across the Jordan. That's the Lord's call to us when setbacks come that we hoped would never come. Get up, get moving, get on across. And what did Joshua do? He got up, he got moving, and he got on across. But he didn't go without some final instructions from the Lord. The Lord told Joshua to be strong and courageous 4 times in chapter 1. We easily remember that phrase. It's emphasized a lot. Yet it's sometimes easier said than done. And God must have known that because he told Joshua to do something else. It's tucked away in Joshua chapter 1 verse 8. Oftentimes we read right past it. The Lord told Joshua, and this is my translation. You're not going to find it in any Bible. This is my translation. The Lord told Joshua, here's what I want you to do. Number 1, study my word continually. Number 2, meditate on it day and night. Number 3, obey everything written in it. Then you'll prosper and succeed in all you'll do. You know, the priest kept a copy of the word. Any king that God's people ever were to have was supposed to take their copy and then write out a copy for themselves. But God is saying that having a copy isn't enough. That a dusty Bible on a shelf is just another book collecting dust. Instead, we need to know it and we need to apply it. That advice is consistent throughout the Bible. From beginning to end, that advice is consistent. We can ignore the word for mere guesswork and still prosper. We ignore it at our peril, yet we do. Moses, my servant, is dead. At that moment, all seemed lost for God's people. Moments like that come for us too. Moments when all seems lost. When they come, we'll be tempted to stray. We'll be tempted to listen to the wrong voices. When they come, we'll be tempted to take the wrong advice. We'll be tempted to give up on God and give up completely. When they come, we'll be tempted to forget that God didn't die when Moses died. We'll be tempted to forget that how we respond determines our progress later on. You'll be tempted to forget, but don't give in to that temptation. Don't give in to that temptation. Remember that how we respond determines our progress later on. Amen.